As a motion designer, the idea of starting a studio might seem intimidating, but that's exactly what 3 of my friends did, and they're quickly turning it into a success story. In this video, I talk with the team at Yond to learn their origin story, get insights into working together, managing clients, and we'll even break down some of their After Effects animations. Whether you're curious about starting a studio yourself or you just want to peek behind the scenes, you're going to love this interview. Well, why don't you guys just tell me a little bit about yourselves so everybody watching knows who we're talking to here. And we'll start with you, Kyle.
Okay, I'm going to go first. All right, so my name is Kyle Krieger. I'm the executive producer here at Yond Studio. I primarily handle working directly with our clients, managing project schedules, making sure everybody is taken care of on the team, making sure our clients are taken care of. And I am based out of Denver, Colorado.
And I'm Alesis Heaps. I'm the creative director here at Yond. And I'm based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. When I'm working with the team here, I'm overseeing the creative vision and making sure everything is hitting that visual aesthetic for our clients.
And I'm Andrew Marston. I am the lead animator at Yond, and I'm based in Arizona.
All right, so you're all over the place. I'm really curious to hear more about how you guys all came together to form this studio. But congratulations, first of all, on the launch of Yond. I've been browsing your website. It looks very well put together, like you've already got some really great work to show off. But I'd just like to hear from you guys. How did Yond come together, and what kind of services do you offer?
Well, Yond came together, I think, this is such an overused term, but like organically, but it just sort of happened, and it happened really in two places that I think a lot of people watching would know. So the first place was inside of a classroom at School of Motion, where I met Andrew. And I was like, who is this overachieving person that is just constantly like turning in homework? And so I got to know Andrew really, really well. And then I attended Camp MoGraph. For anybody who hasn't attended Camp MoGraph, it's like camp, but for motion designers. And it was fantastic. And I met Alesis just walking on a trail. And the second year when we both attended, we had a conversation at a picnic table where Andrew and I were wanting to try to get something off of the ground, but we knew that we were a triangle and missing of one point. And Alesis came in and really just completed that. So then we could sort of go on our own quest together, and that's kind of how it formed. We share a love of animation, of design, of working well together, and we're all committed to constant improvement in terms of like, hey, this process is working really well, or hey, that process didn't quite work well, and it's helped us. Every single project we've done has just gotten better and better because we're committed to looking at it in the broader picture and sticking together.
That's incredible. So I'm curious then, what were you doing before you decided to form this group? Were you all working for a studio or freelancing? What did each one of your jobs look like before this?
When Kyle approached me, I was freelance, had been in various studios previously, and kind of kept bouncing back and forth between having this desire to be a part of a team, but not really finding the right one that was going to be exactly that core strength that I needed. I was kind of feeling this urge for this like camaraderie and general like geekishness that I always felt at Camp MoGraph every time I went. I was like, how do I make this a thing somehow? And so when Kyle approached me, I was like, this might be it. This dude's energy is unmatched and is exactly what I needed. That kind of just filled my inspiration cup back up, and he introduced me to Andrew, and the rest is history.
I was a freelance motion designer at different agencies and studios, and I felt very similar to what Alesis described, where I was looking forward to having a consistent team, maybe having a little more say in the process, because usually I was at the bottom, at the end of the production chain. But yeah, consistent team was a big one for me. Yeah, when I met Kyle, he also filled a gap where I'm not really a business person. I can fake it until I make it. I can send invoices, but I don't really generate leads or do sales. And there's a whole business side of running your own freelance solo business that a lot of freelancers deal with that is not my skill set. So when I met Kyle, and that is right up his alley, that was a perfect pairing. And as more of a technical artist, sort of an After Effects technician, um, we I really need like a creative director or designer at the helm telling me where the ship is going and what do these frames look like, and I'll make it happen in After Effects. And so when I met Alesis, it was just perfect because she's a creative genius.
And then for me, I did a stint in mascotting, both on the college football field and on the ski slope, which, by the way, just a terrible idea. Don't ever mascot on a ski slope. And then, spent a number of years in corporate America and founded my own agency with my wife in a couple years back. And the animation portion of our business started to grow, and I knew that what would be the best is to spin off the animation business as its own individual being, so it could have new life and breathe, and thus Yond was formed.
Amazing. And just to be completely transparent with anyone watching, I do know all three of these amazing people. So these questions are for your benefit. But Kyle and I, we live really close to each other. We're friends.
Yes,
and
we do.
Andrew and I have met multiple times, and same for Alesis. I met at Camp Mograph as well. So check out Camp Mograph. Not sponsored, but definitely worth your time. So this is really cool. Andrew, one thing that you said that I think maybe if I had continued under the motion designer career path, I really connected with the idea of having the consistency from project to project. Because when I was freelancing, I was, project to project, working with different studios, usually just with the producer, never with another creative person. I was just the guy who got brought on to do the animation. So I can completely appreciate that desire, especially at this stage in life. We're in similar stages of life, and having consistency with the people you work with, I'm sure, is huge for you guys. So that's really cool. So do you ever work with other outside artists on some of these projects that you've been creating?
Well, we do have quite a big wheelhouse. So if a client came to us and wanted to do an explainer, we would be able to handle that from start to finish. But in terms of scaling and when we would need to scale beyond what our team is doing, yes, we absolutely do work with other freelancers, other artists to complement and bring as part of the core project. But all three of us have some hand in that overall, so that we have a consistent level of quality, a consistent level of process. And that way it's understood that it is a Yond product as opposed to just sort of a free market commodity, if you will.
Sure. No, that makes sense. And that kind of goes back to the idea of having that producer who's finding those people that can fill the need. When I was freelancing, I had a few producers that came back to me because they're like, you get the job done, you're stay on time. So I'm sure, like, for things like sound design and any kind of specialty that might be outside of Andrew's animation.
I do have to reveal, we do have a secret member of the team. He is a sound designer. He works with us exclusively. He is just preferred to stay in the shadows as a shadowy, mysterious figure. I think he's hitting a triangle somewhere. But we do have sound design as part of our in-house. They're just not public facing.
Okay, fair enough. Cool. So let's talk about the production process for any given project. Recently you've produced this project for Grapeseed that is just incredible. From one frame to the next, I'm just blown away by how much work has gone into every single scene in this video. But could we talk about your production process from start to finish? Kind of just how do you handle a project this large, and where does it even start? I'm assuming with you, Kyle.
Yeah, I think every project starts with a call and an idea. And the really interesting part is the intentions sometimes can get misaligned, and everybody can see an opportunity and get really excited and just rush through it and get a contract done. And all of a sudden you're 2 weeks into the project going, what did we do? So a lot of that comes with having those conversations initially and really digging deep of like, why is this important? What are the key messages that are going to come across? And for us, we always like to provide clients with a menagerie of options of where a project can go, so that we really kind of understand, okay, why are we going this direction? Have we looked at all other options? So a lot of it starts with understanding what the opportunity is, why it's important, if doing nothing is an option, which more often than not, sometimes it is, making sure it's actually a real project. And then from there, making sure that we can work with them to locate, the direction that they would generally want to go to. And then at that phase, when we know it's a serious project, we know that there are serious buyers and serious budgets involved. That's typically when I pick up I don't have my phone with me, but I pick up a phone. It's yellow and it has a Steelers logo, and then that's when Alesis comes into the picture and talks about creative direction. So, Alesis, I don't know if you want to talk about how that works.
Sure. Yeah, with this project specifically, I was approached by a contact of mine who was familiar with my work. I like doing characters. I like doing colorful stuff. And they were like, hey, we have this job that's characters and colorful stuff. Are you interested in giving a bid? So we put together, I think this is pretty uncommon, but I love the pitching phase. I am no adrenaline junkie. I will not go base jumping or cliff diving or anything to get my fix, but put me in those like high stakes pitching and getting someone invested in an idea, and I'm into it. I get like a high that I can't get anywhere else. So pitching is super fun, and we were thrilled to collaborate, me and Kyle, on what does this look like, what's going to get them excited and also solve their problem, and also we are satisfied with what we're putting together. So we grab some references, type up a bit of a director's treatment of here's what we have in mind, here's why this is solving your issue, here's why we think this is important, just to get a bit of buy-in. From there, once everything awards, you go through a bit of back and forth and fun, and we just kind of get to start actually making that idea that we just pitched a reality. And we start putting together even more mood boarding, start doing some concept sketching, start getting into style framing. At that point, me and Andrew will usually start collaborating to some degree of, hey, based on this budget we just said, can we accomplish these things that I have unfortunately maybe gotten a little overboard and excited about? And we kind of work hand in hand to try to make this make sense and bring everything to life in Andrew's beautiful technical wizardry that he has with those keyframes and those plugins and clicks.
Yeah, and there's two things I'll add to that. When we're in the pitching process, I know that it's sort of like highly debatable, but I think at a certain point you have a responsibility to really repeat back what you've heard and elaborate upon it, because we're here to lift things above and beyond what typically a client would want to have. So having that is a big part of the process. The second part is making sure that we're setting ourselves up and the client up for success. So a lot of it is us working together before we even submit any cost information to really work through those timelines. Andrew is fantastic about finding where all those little weak spots can be and making sure we're shored up from a budget perspective. So it puts the client in a successful position, so we're not asking for large, in really any overages. And it puts us in the position where we're understanding the time commitment, how that works within our existing project schedules. The last thing I'll say is on scripting. So specifically on this one, we worked with the client. They had another agency that was a bit more specialized in video scripts, and they came in and helped tremendously to get the script to a place where that helped inform the storyboards, that helps inform the design frame. So there's a lot of collaboration and a lot of moving parts going on, and I'm sure some of your audience may be individuals who do this on their own. Just keep writing down all of the jobs that you yourself would have to do in order to make a project like this happen. And by the way, this is all before we've gotten into animation,
right?
Or any changes. But Andrew, do you want to kind of chat about, like, once we've gotten the designs to where they need to be, how are you approaching that?
Can I just interject
Yeah.
real quick before we move on to that, Andrew? Hold that thought. But this is just fascinating to me because, again, going back to when I was freelancing, I had no part in any of what you just talked about. And so you are handling all of this upfront pitching stuff before anything's been agreed upon, before you've been chosen as the agency that's going to get the work done, before money is exchanging hands. So the stakes seem very high at this point of the process, where you have to put in the work to have something to pitch this client, But even before that, Kyle, you were talking about having to just have conversations with the client and see what their needs are and how you could solve the problem. That's time consuming. I'm sure there have been times where you haven't gotten the client. So how do you prepare not only financially, but just mentally for the possibility that this might lead to nothing?
Candles, chocolate, and therapy. No, I think the key thing is like when we're talking about pitching is the amount of spec work that is or isn't being done. So we limit ourselves. We didn't create mock-up or create whole projects. I mean, that's a massive red flag if that needs to happen. A lot of it is just listening, understanding, pulling reference, creating ideas that are infant in their way, and sort of building an environment for them to play and creating that collaborative environment. And losses happen. It hurts when losses occur, but I think it's just part of the flow. It's part of the process. What we found is that when we can really listen to clients, when we can really ask those, somebody once told me, if you're sort of unsure about something or your gut says something, just be brave for 5 seconds. And if you have something to say it gently. And so a lot of times it's just asking those questions like, is doing nothing an option? Should we come to the best idea possible? Would you be able to sign off on that in the next 2 weeks? And if clients aren't willing to be forthright with their decision-making process, then to pull back the amount of invested time that you're going to go. So our process is all from customer evidence, from getting one place to the other and listening. So, I've been doing this for, I'm going to date myself, but 18, 20 years of doing it, of just a lot of back and forth and relating with people. And yeah, I mean, people are wonderful, amazing creatures, but we also can create happiness and sadness. So it's just kind of part of it.
And what Kyle's describing is, qualifying these leads. And not every time that we are approached by or approaching a company to do work for them, do we do a full director's treatment, a full pitch process. Sometimes, just through those questions that Kyle's asking, we might say like, I don't know if this is worth our time, or I don't know if it's important that we answer all these questions up front. Maybe they just need a simple bid just to see if we're even within the ballpark of what they need us to do, if we're solving their problems, or if we're just creating more work for ourselves. So that kind of helps us by asking these questions and by taking these steps to decide if that investment is worth our time or not. So it's a bit of a balance and just kind of taking a couple of risks, but they're calculated.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So then let's say that you've gotten this pitch sent over and it is time to get to Andrew and say, okay, what do you think of this? Andrew, where in this process are you coming in and how do you handle this information that you're getting?
Well, first and foremost, my role on the team is to enable the creative process. Like I said before, I'm much more technical, and so I usually don't analyze the creative ideas, or I try to get out of the way as much as possible. And once the concept and the creative is all established, that's when I'll go in, usually fairly early, once we have like storyboards and script, and look at, is this, what would it take to achieve this in After Effects or whatever program we're going to be using. The idea of not wearing as many hats to run my own animation business was very appealing to me, and that's one of the big benefits of starting a studio and being part of a team. Although there's a lot of trust involved, where now I'm not doing my own sales and I'm not following up on invoices and everything that Kyle does, and I don't have as much control in the design and the creative that Alesis does. There's a lot of trust there, which is great, and it allows me to focus all my effort on the things that I enjoy the most, and I dare say am the best at. When looking at all the skills I could offer, that was another appealing thing about starting a studio, was just taking off some of those hats and letting somebody else who's better at it wear them.
It makes total sense. That seems like the exact reason why you might want to start a studio, or at least find others to work with. All right, so that's great insight. Now, let's say that you're all good to go. You've submitted, Andrew, that yes, okay, we can make this happen with that budget. This is how much time it'll take. I think we're good to go. We've got the green light. You go back to the client. and I assume have some kind of a discussion about scheduling and like the calendar of the production and what's involved in terms of when they're going to see updates and how many revisions they're going to get or overage charges, things like that. Is that right, Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, a lot of the shots that Andrew had, he's not looking out that until we've already done all of this in agreement. So a lot of it
Okay.
takes like sort of foresight to understand and having a good understanding. And I learned from the good folks over at Swarovski. They're just a small little place in Chicago. From some of their elite producers, and a lot of it was explaining to the client what is in scope and also explicitly laying out what is out of scope. It is not uncommon for ideas to grow different tentacles and want to become bigger. That is the core of an idea. And pardon me, the challenge is, can you make sure that it stays within the scope that is defined for everybody? It's not easy at times.
Yeah.
It requires a good level of trust and back and forth with that. And if we really feel that it's worthy enough, then the scope will increase. But that's something that takes a lot of time, and people don't always get it right up front. Sometimes the client doesn't scope right, and sometimes creative doesn't scope right.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think, what is there a part of this management of the client process that, Kyle, that you just flat out don't enjoy? Is there a part that you just are dreading every project or anything like that?
No, I mean, here's the thing. Like, the biggest thing is you're forming relationships with people. So, as a human, anybody who's ever formed a relationship with another human, like, you already know the playbook. Like, there's ups, there's downs, there's personality things or whatever. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is we have a service mindset. Like, we are here to serve the client. Bottom line. Like, that is that. But we also have a responsibility to speak up from a creative perspective and work to have an understanding of that. And the hard part that sometimes happens is you'll get stories where either difficult situations can arrive, and then people will run to polar ends of arguments. And the core part is coming to a mutual understanding, and it's just constantly working to come to an understanding. So, there are times that aren't always great, but at the end of the day, you're forming relationships with people, and you're providing a really important service. And if you have a service mindset, that's really helpful. But if you let yourself dwell in negativity and let that stew around, it can become really unhealthy. And then that becomes where people want to cancel projects, or you never get hired back. So it's an interesting balance you have to have externally and also internally, so you can manage certain stressful situations so that you can come into those professional situations with the level of professionalism and a plan, quite frankly.
Yeah, that's makes total sense to me. What about the scripting aspect of this project, though? You said that the client had worked with somebody to already develop this script, so that was handed to you. What kind of visual direction was included with that?
In this instance, it was a little gray as to what exactly they wanted to see throughout the spot. It was a really ambitious concept that was very abstract and vague, but they had a really good idea on the general direction they wanted to go with it. We were representing these guide-like characters who kind of represent their own team members, and they're taking this customer on a journey into this wild, vast, unknown region. And their company is about media buying. Admittedly, whenever we're going into any project, we are doing preliminary general research of like learning how the company works, what exactly is the services they provide, so that we can best represent those. But we kind of need to skim the waters on that. If you go too deep, you're just going to get bogged down in the nitty gritty. So having someone from their team working really closely with the scriptwriter to help to bridge the gap between our lack of knowledge in the ins and outs of their business and our visual ability to represent abstract ideas really helps. So they gave us not only the copy on a 2-column script, but also general scene guidelines of this is kind of what we want to see here to represent this idea of a character lost in the world and trying to navigate around. And from there, we would kind of take that improv yes and approach to it. If there was ever anything that they were proposing that was like, that might be hard to pull off with our budget, but maybe we could do something like this. There's a psychology to making no sound a lot like yes. That is just taking a bit of their energy and just flipping it and turning a bit of lemonade from some lemons.
Great. Yeah, I love all of that analogy. What is your first step as a designer or creative director, taking a script like that and beginning to make visuals? Like, I'm just even thinking general things of like, how do you choose a color palette? How are you deciding on the art style?
Yes. When we are doing a project kickoff, we like to just get a bit of an insight into, well, I ask a lot of questions. What exactly have you guys seen that you like, just to get a bit of a barometer of maybe styles they might be approaching? Because when people think of animation, their first instinct is usually cartoon. And that makes a lot of companies go, ah. So there's a level of just kind of an art history lesson of teaching maybe different styles that they just don't know. They don't know what they don't know, and that's all right. So you have to ask those types of questions, maybe bring up some references ideally so that they have just something to point to and react to and say, I like this, but I don't really like that. Maybe there's some sort of mishmash. It's about asking questions, it's about listening to kind of land on a style. For me, I'd like to do a little bit of sketching and general concept art. Sometimes that goes really well, and clients are really good at visualizing what can be. Sometimes it's difficult. It's like, I thought that this was going to be clean vector art. What is this sketchy style that you're
Yeah.
showing me? And it's a game of understanding what clients are familiar with and what they're not. And just that's the job of an art director. You need to communicate this technical knowledge that we are very familiar with on a day-to-day basis and put it into the translation that they can understand and feel comfortable with.
Yeah. And Andrew, are you seeing these early sketches? Are you seeing this whole part of the process playing out, just waiting for your turn to be put into the game?
I try to avoid, especially in the early stages, I try to avoid it as much as possible because aside from just letting me do like check, is this feasible, while they're landing on the concept and the style and the design, it's really just brief conversations with me of, can you execute this style? We don't know exactly the details yet. It's really once we start to get into the storyboard phase and then style frames for sure, that's when I get more involved.
Okay. Because I mean, this final piece has what stood out to me the most was a lot of character rigging, and in lots of different scenarios and scenes and facial expressions. So like that's where my mind immediately goes to in terms of workload. It's like I gotta rig a lot of things before I can even make a move. So yeah, I was just curious how much of that you're thinking about before it even gets into your hands.
Yeah, I think that the part that a lot of freelance motion designers who are just hired at a day rate don't see is how much work goes into just getting them a style frame. Everything that we've set up until this point, like Kyle and Alesis are trying to figure out what we're making while also, you know, defining the terms of the agreement and the budget. And then once we have a budget, what can we do with that budget? And all of those discussions and the style, those are happening well before I'm involved. And then it's only once we have a script and storyboards that I can start thinking about how many rigs do we need, how many rigs do we have time for. Yeah, so I'm usually involved a little bit later than in the concepting.
Yeah.
For this specific project, this is Notion. I created a database that has every single shot, and then inside that shot's task, I have sub uh, data points that list every single piece of animation that might need to go into accomplishing this. Like here we have this waterfall shot, and so we're going to need to animate the environment plants. That's probably going to take 2 hours. Then we have the waterfall. That's going to take 4 hours. And I add that all up, and I say, how many hours is that? Do we think this, passes the common sense test, and does that fit within the scheduled time? And if not, how can we make it fit within that time? Are there things we can cut out? So that's usually at this phase before we're actually animating. That's my involvement in the process.
Okay. That I am thoroughly impressed with how detailed you get into that I've never put so much thought into any project when I was asked, how much do you think you'd charge for this? So that's, I fully believe that you are a technical person based on this document. So, but it sounds like it's a really great pairing of being able to kind of take your mind off of that creative side of it. Not that you're not creative. The animation, you are so much better of a motion designer than you claim to be, and as far as art goes, and the art side of things, but not having to put as much into what are we going to make this thing look like, and being able to just take the reins of how are we going to make this thing move. I really, again, I can see myself like having that freedom of not having to think about another part of the process and just focusing on what I really enjoy doing. So, and I hope that is what you enjoy doing the most.
I'd say it's right around probably the first round of style frames where we, I think, started to have Andrew in this conversation for Grapeseed specifically. I needed to, maybe it was storyboards. Could be either. Either way. We need to have a conversation of these are the scenes that we're proposing before we send these to client. Are there anything that you see in here that's like a red flag? Like, whoa, I can't make a waterfall that looks like it's 200 feet deep between these two scenes. We're going to need to find some sort of middle ground, or there's too many characters in this one. Or even if there's only, I think we only had 4 characters, but maybe that required 10 unique rigs. Can we somehow change the perspective of one of these scenes so that that reduces the amount of rigging I have to do? So it's definitely a conversation collaboratively that keeps us in check for scope creep.
Actually, on this specific one, I have the Millinote board that I made of our style frames when we doing exactly what you described, Jake, of looking at every single shot, looking at all the characters there, and deciding what sort of rig are we going to need to make, and then how many rigs does that equal, just as a concrete example. And I think this was the most involved I was just the rigging discussion at this phase in the storyboards. And then, yeah, much later, once the style frames were being developed, did we start talking about more specifics. But yeah, I would lay out all of the storyboards and then arrange them into different columns based on what sort of rig was used. And I ended up being able to combine a few. I just made one super rig that was about 80% of the main character. But yeah, these sorts of considerations need to happen early, or else we're going to get in over our heads.
Totally. Alesis, what do you do when it comes to like the storyboards that we just looked at? How deep into the actual playthrough of the animation are you going when you're thinking about your designs? Like, are you considering how are we going to get from this frame to this frame, or is there going to be a camera move here that I need to account for? How far into that are you actually thinking when you're designing these different frames?
For storyboards specifically, I'm certainly thinking about it from the onset. I'm considering camera angles, camera moves, just general composition, and how that translates into motion as I am drawing them. And back when I was a freelancer and I was doing both sides of this production process, both the design and the animation, there was a certain limitation in my mind of like, I'm going to have to figure out this problem. I'll figure it out now rather than later. And now there's a balance. There's obviously, I don't want to put Andrew in any situation where it's like, figure it out, buddy, even though I know he's perfectly capable of doing so. And it usually adds a little bit of that yes and to pretty much any scene I ever give him. But I definitely just try to be a little bit prescriptive when I can. I'm envisioning maybe there's some sort of white between these two frames. Ideally, of like an element might move from in front of the foreground environment and kind of help us transition to another one. But specifically in style or storyboards, I try not to get too prescriptive in when I'm drawing those. It's a very impressionistic medium by nature, because you just don't, if you don't have to go anywhere yet, it's best to keep that level of uncertainty for your benefit of being able to maybe solve those problems down the road if it just makes more sense to answer those questions in animation, or at least this next phase of style frames. And also, sometimes storyboards can be very confusing for clients who've just never really experienced them before. Like, what is this cartoon strip that I'm looking at? And having some level of freedom to help them kind of understand what exactly they're looking at, knowing that it's a bit more fluid. We haven't exactly laid out how these transitions work, but this is what we're thinking for them, just helps to get them a bit more on board and clear in the direction visually that this is going to go. It's all about nailing that structure first before you start building up the actual design of the house.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I can really see in your guys' work just how much thought is put into this design phase because I mean, I'm glad that you mentioned that you think about these camera angles and the scenery like it's a movie set essentially. There's always a foreground, middle ground, and background in every shot in this piece, and it's very well thought out and constructed as an environment, an actual place, versus something a little bit more sterile, more motion graphic-y that's just, text on a color background. And so there's a lot more thought and I think artistic vision put into this piece specifically. And I just want to say, like, it came across like it is. The first time I saw this piece, I was just like, wow, so that's what happens when you get more than one person involved in the production of a video. So yeah, I think it's just excellent, the amount of thought you're putting into these things. And before you hand it off to Andrew. Let's get to the point where you are ready to hand things off to Andrew. And Andrew, I'm assuming you've seen frames before you're, obviously diving into animate them. But when you receive those from Alesis, what is the first step of your process?
So when I get the style frames from Alesis, that's really when my job revs up and I'm full on working on this project. They usually look something like this. And in this case, it's a little intimidating. Usually my first thing is to think, don't freak out, because we have just layers on layers of detail and exquisite design that I don't want to mess up. I want all this to be preserved. And so my first step is to try to go through every single element of every single style frame and figure out a plan to get that into After Effects. And oftentimes I'm using Overlord because it's the fastest, and I feel compelled to say that because I'm talking with a battle axe in play.
Again, not sponsored.
No. I'll send as much as I can to After Effects or rebuild it with native After Effects shapes and gradients to give myself the most control. But sometimes that's not possible. Like in this, let me see if I can isolate it. In this map, give it a sec. In this map here, there's all these wonderful textures and lighting effects and everything. And so sometimes I will just import the Illustrator file, or if we're in a pinch, then I will export a transparent PNG at like 4x the dimensions of specific assets, and then I will rebuild it all in After Effects. So here we are. Sounds like a tutorial. Here we are in After Effects. And so to give you an idea, like that shot, this is one of the smaller shots. I'll put all the layers into After Effects. I'll make sure that every blend mode, opacity, every effect that I can convert, like Gaussian blur, I'll redo those. And then when I think I've got it, I will load a static PNG in difference mode on top in After Effects to double check that this is already in motion, so it doesn't match exactly. But theoretically, the whole frame should be black if I've done my job right, because there should be no difference between what I've recreated in After Effects and what the style frame was. So yeah, that's the first part of my process. I guess the other thing is looking through all of the shots and planning out what rigs I might need to make or what difficult animation situations I might be finding myself in, and trying to create either some animation tests or actually go into that style frame and start with those tricky animations to make sure that I'm not going to get caught with the whole animation is done, except I never found a solution for how to make the waterfall, for example. So yeah, that's usually where I start, is Illustrator, bring it into After Effects, recreate it shot by shot exactly, and then isolate difficult animation sections and make sure I have a solve for those.
I work with Andrew on a daily basis, and I'm learning a lot about your process just from this here.
Great
Amazing.
insight. So looking at this document in Illustrator, Alesis, I honestly, my first thought wasn't that you made these in Illustrator because of how much detail there is. So I'm curious, are you primarily working in Illustrator, or does it depend on the project and the needs of the graphics?
It is. I'm primarily an illustrator, and I think it's just a habit at this point. I became really spoiled by Overlord. Again, not a plug, but just truth, and just being able to grab assets as I needed to just send over immediately was just super nice. And also, just so many times where staying in vector is just so convenient, knowing that we don't have to worry about like the scaling. Like, what if we need this in 4K in a couple of years, and then I have to like change all these assets over again? It I find it just to be a bit more of a smooth process. So yeah, a lot of it I think requires some brute force and like weird solutions. Like I know I can do better glows and gradients and such in Photoshop, but I find workarounds within Illustrator that work just fine.
Yeah. And I'm sure, Andrew, you do at some point add in effects in After Effects as well for cinematic flair, right?
Oh, for sure. And there are some effects, especially like layer style, or I'm not sure what the outer glows and the drop shadows that you apply in Illustrator. I usually will recreate those in After Effects with something very similar, because they don't always convert one to one. There's some things that just are different between the two programs. So there's a little bit of freedoms taken, so long as the as close as possible the design's been recreated in a faithful way. Well, if it's really far off, then Alesis and I will have a discussion about, is this important that this glow is perfectly preserved, or is there latitude to kind of shift it just slightly?
Yeah. And Elise is just looking at Andrew dial through each one of these layers. It's clear like you're putting a lot of thought again into this environment and giving Andrew plenty of artwork to work with and to create something that feels more immersive. Um, you have a background in animation and motion graphics as well, though, right?
Somewhat. A lot of my bachelor's degree was in digital film and video production. My background is really more so in live action production, being on set. I leaned into post production eventually, just because I find production shoots to be very stressful, and I liked being behind a computer. Eventually, I just started gravitating towards. I liked doing a lot of lower thirds and animation. When I could, with just titles and effects for my daily work, and figured out what motion design was and said, I'm going to make this my actual job, and brute force self taught myself the rest.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Andrew appreciates it because you have the benefit of knowing, oh, I have to put the rest of the character behind this map. I can't just do the head and the hands. Like I have to think about that's going to move, and there's some elements there that you can't even see with all of the layers on. So that I think that puts you just miles ahead of a lot of illustrators who don't have any idea what goes into the animation, where their whole idea is just, I'm gonna just make the thing look pretty and not even have, a concept of how it's gonna be handled after I'm done with it. Is there any part of your design process, your creative direction process that you just don't care for?
Um, Receiving vague direction is tough. I don't have any qualms with the feedback process. And usually, when I'm getting vague direction, it's a failure in my part somehow. I didn't do enough explaining of what this process looked like, what type of feedback we needed to receive. I try to be as prescriptive about that as possible in every phase. Like in storyboards, we are looking for feedback on general composition, what is happening in each scene, notes on the characters that are being presented. Things we don't want to hear about yet is any type of design notes, because we're not obviously there yet. But there's those moments where you get something that's just like, I'm not really liking this one. I don't know why. So you just have to ask more questions, and that slows things down. But like I said, it's a process, and we're here to serve. So you got to get through that process in whatever way. You got to dig to the bottom of what that vague feedback is actually getting at.
Yeah. I'm sure any part of the process can relate to that. The vague feedback is just the worst. Okay, so let's talk about Andrew. What is your technical process for working with such amazing looking artwork and turning it into animated pieces? What software are you using? What third-party tools are you using? What kind of rigging are you doing? Give me all the details.
Um, sure. I guess if anybody's looking at this After Effects for how my UI layout is, this is not how my UI usually is. I just wanted to simplify it for these demonstration purposes. So once I have the art into After Effects, it really depends, obviously, on the shot. So one thing to highlight, I guess, pretty much every shot in this piece has a parallax effect. So the layers, let me enable the behind the scenes camera here. So if I enable this camera, you can see that this shot, all the layers that is spread out in 3D space. And so there is a technical hurdle there of how can I do that efficiently without that agonizing process of pushing something back in Z space and then scaling it up. And so I created like a rig that would, if I parent a layer to a null and then scale that null up, then that would push the layers back in Z space while also scaling them up appropriately. And then I unparent that layer before I move the camera, and it will preserve the exact pixels of that design, but have that pushed back in Z space. And you can also see, like here, there's that nice little cone of the layers scaling up as they move back in Z space. Let's see. From a technical standpoint, here is the kind of the master timeline. I am a big pre-comper, and so when I go shot by shot, I will make each shot its own pre-comp. Sometimes a couple shots will run into each other, but then I will lay everything out on the master timeline with the voiceover and the boardomatic usually, and chop them all up. And then if there's any transitions that make more sense to do on a global level, then I can do them here. But then if I need to get specific into a shot, then I can dig in without impacting potentially all the other layers. Also, from a layer management standpoint, I mean, this project had thousands of layers. So pre-comping
Yeah,
and just having one master timeline was sort of a necessity.
absolutely.
Do you mind if I just show a few rigs and you can choose?
This is what I'm here for, Andrew.
Oh,
Show me
okay.
everything.
Okay, cool. So you mentioned the character rig,
Yeah.
which we use, especially for this hero character, we use throughout. So I developed, here she is. I developed this one master rig, and we've got all these controls, kind of a mix. So the core of all my character rigs are rubber hose, limbs parented to a torso, and then things are connected to that. And then usually, just because I like the aesthetic, I'll use some of the controllers from Duick and parent them to have a little bit more control. And in this case, this rig, we needed a couple specific moments. Let me turn off adaptive resolution here. Okay. We need a couple specific moments, like her hands need to hold the backpack straps. And so what I found when I rigged this up is I would bring this hand up, and the elbow wouldn't be quite where I wanted it to be. And so in this case, I dug into the rubber hose, the core path that drives the shape. And you can add, attached to the bend, you can add like a point control to offset the second point in that path. So I added essentially like an elbow control so that we could really get that specific arm position that you could play. I was playing with the direction of the limb and how much bend, or how much, what's the actual, yeah, how much bend was happening, but it wasn't quite as precise as just offsetting the elbow. So that's one example of how we would take kind of a standard rigging tool and make it more custom. That's pretty common in what I do, because the rubber hose is always my default for the limbs. It's just so quick to render.
I'm not paying Andrew to say this.
Use the code Andrew for 0% off at checkout. There's a lot to go into here. I will say that I used to link all of the properties I wanted to control into essential graphics and then control the character from the level above. But recently, I've actually just been duplicating. I know that people out there are gasping right now, but I've been duplicating the character template comp and doing the animation within that comp. And the reason is because as the project progresses, sometimes I need to tweak the base rig to meet a special situation. And I don't want the liability of that breaking something in other shots. The only time, the only other, the rig where I did use essential graphics is these bugs. We had a million of these bugs that are on this anthill, and each one needs to have a different logo, but they all essentially move the same. So we invested the time to make a bug rig, and then with replaceable media, we can swap out the logo. There are controls to switch it from side view to top view. We can rotate the head. We have some adaptive resolution going on there. But then with this one rig in the main shot here, this one, let me see. Yeah, then we have all of these. They're the same comp, but they use essential properties. And if you don't know what essential properties are, watch Jake's video on essential properties. Very powerful stuff. So essentially, with the one-time investment of making a bug rig, we were able to quickly do this whole anthill. And one thing I'm especially proud of that you can edit out if you want, but are these legs. I couldn't figure out how to make bug legs. So what I did was I just made one leg, and I made these paths that would. I made these paths for each joint to follow for the walk cycle, and then I just animated one walk cycle or two walk cycles for that one leg, and then linked that through essential properties to an angle control. And then every single leg is the same leg, but then we offset the motion with like a frame delay.
Wow. That's incredible. So go back to that leg comp. Were those just guides that you were using to manually keyframe the path, or are those linked up with nulls or something?
Yeah, I probably could have done. I probably could have done it a little bit with less layers, but I took the quick route where I have these two paths right here, and then I just did a trace path, and I got, or I think it was, yeah, I got trace path, or maybe it was points follow.
So
Nulls follow points.
The point or the vertices of that path then are following that shape around. Is that what you're saying?
Oh no, it's the opposite. It's really just, it's like a trace path where there's we're making the points, the points of that path,
right,
of this leg path here. If we look at the expression, the points of that path are following nulls as they rotate around those walk cycle guides.
That's awesome. I'm completely understand why you're proud of that. Like, that's the kind of stuff that gets me going too, when I can think of a solution for something complicated, especially like anatomy of a bug that you just don't understand how it works. It's like, I know what it should look like. Let me just do it and then duplicate it and retime it. Like, that's brilliant. I love that you were able to figure that out.
Thank you. I have a few other. Oh yeah, and the other thing is reference. Whenever I'm doing character, because I don't identify as a character animator, it's kind of intimidating. So I almost always will do reference.
Yeah.
And it doesn't always line up 1-to-1, but it helps tremendously. So definitely. I don't know if this will play back at real time. Okay. No, absolutely.
How large are these comps, by the way?
This comp is a little bit wider than HD. So this one specifically I needed a little bit of latitude to pan. So it's 2300 by 1080. The final project was 1920 by 1080. So just standard HD. And when Alesis said, hey, if we need to come back in a couple of years to do 4K, I was like, oh, please. I hope I'm retired at that point. So yeah, shooting reference is invaluable in my opinion, and I don't always match what I've performed 1-to-1, but seeing how weight shifts and some nuance has been really, really helpful. I think there's one more. This one, this is a social post that will be made at some point, but yeah, the character dips down and the weight goes onto one arm, and this is playing back at full res, that's why it's kind of chugging here, but then needs to look around and is going to hold up a magnifying glass, and I just couldn't get a natural motion until I decided to act it out myself.
Right.
And you look really, and if anybody walked in on me doing this, it'd be like, what are you okay, man?
Yeah.
But
well, kudos to you for sharing it with us, because that is a little intimidating. But I think you talk to any animator, a professional animator who has to try and match something that feels a little more realistic, they're either recording themselves or they're looking in a mirror. So you're in good company. So are these joysticks and sliders, or are they do-it connectors? What are you using here?
So it's all kind of a mishmash. I don't actually use do-it for rigging anymore. Some of the core expressions in their connectors I've sort of pared down and made into K-bar buttons, but the only rigging tool I actually use, and this sounds is rubber hose. And that feels such like product placement, but it's true. And then everything else, I use Do-It for the icons, the controller icons. And then all of these down here are just custom. I've made them myself. And then they control various properties. And then I have a whole project file, an After Effects project file that I import that has kind of the toolkit of these that are ready to go.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for giving us the behind the scenes look at this After Effects project and the level of complexity. I love seeing how different motion designers handle managing all of this kind of stuff. One thing we haven't really talked about yet is the voiceover. So you have the script, but when did the voiceover come in? Are you recording Scratch VO to work with, Andrew, or is the voiceover talent brought in at an early phase? How does that work?
Yes, for the voiceover, it's somewhere in between. When we start casting for that, we cast before the script is necessarily locked, so that we can kind of get that process rolling. And we use voices 1, 2, 3, or I'll reach out to voiceover artists that I've worked in the past to ask for a custom audition, get a little bit of feedback after we get casting specs from the client. In order to do that, you want a female voice, you want a male voice, what type of tone, what sort of delivery are we looking for? And while all of that is moving along in the background, we're still locking scripts. We're just about to start storyboards. Sometimes if we haven't received that voiceover back yet, we will certainly work with a Scratch. I don't love hearing my own voice, but when there is a female voiceover talent, it only makes sense that I will lend my voice. And since I don't have to do the animation anymore, Andrew just has to suffer through hearing me limp along in a voiceover.
When does that final voiceover really get recorded? Is that after everything's been kind of picture locked?
Yeah, it's after. Usually, in this case for Grapeseed, I know that it was after we had already gotten through style frames. We were just kind of going back and forth on a couple things, so that ended up kind of kicking along a little further down the road than we normally like to do. If I'm not mistaken, we did the first animatic with a Scratch, and then we got the voiceover track for the professional one and plugged that in for animatic R2.
Okay, so Andrew, you were actually animating to the final voiceover.
Yes, that was a luxury. But the animatic phase, and in case anybody just wants a quick outline of the phases, it's boardomatic, which is like a slideshow, animatic, which is just the general motions for pacing and concept approval. Then we actually get into the weeds of real animation. For the animatic, I believe it was a Scratch VO.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe.
Cool.
I think so.
And when you get to that animatic phase, Andrew, you are beginning to do the actual keyframing and the full motion. Are you starting at the first scene and just working linearly through the whole progression, or are you jumping around?
Jumping around, usually in order of difficulty of the animations that I foresee. So I start with the hardest ones that I think might be the biggest technical hurdles, and then I can breathe easier and easier as I go through. And at the end, it's just a few like easy, you know, position animations.
Yeah. And are you giving the client any kind of peek into how this motion is turning out before the entire thing is ready to view? Or are you waiting until you can just present the whole thing as a complete product to them?
This was the first time that this particular client was doing an animation, so they were pretty green to the process. And in my experience, breaking apart and demystifying the process is usually, and maybe not too much, but just enough to make it not overstimulating and still feeling like they're kind of a part of it and being held along with us on this journey, rather than being like, we're going to hide behind this curtain and we'll show you when we're done and then you can give us feedback. So we specifically started breaking down the process a bit more than we might normally. We did a boardomatic, even though I think we didn't initially set out to plan to do so, just so we could get through that initial bit of feedback of this is the timing of how this is going to go. Do you have any thoughts? Then from there, animatic got us a little closer to this is the blocking of characters through scenes. All of this is ideal. Like we try to kind of have this funnel approach of we want to get through the biggest. I'm trying to frame my funnel, but it's not working. There we go. We want to try to get through the biggest problems early so that as they trickle down through the funnel, it becomes quicker, smoother, easier. And hopefully by the time it gets like really into the complicated parts of animation, we don't have to deal with the like, I don't know if I like the character moving in that way. Can it move from left to right instead of right to left? We don't have to do all of that because that makes things more time costly and just bogs down the process for Andrew. We like him to solve creative problems and technical problems that are going to make the work better, not necessarily the feedback issues from client early on.
Yeah, great. Now, Andrew, I asked the other two this question. I forgot to ask you. Is there any part of your process with motion design or the animation that you particularly just don't like, you don't enjoy doing?
Uh, I don't enjoy when I get feedback that means I need to change a rig
Oh, yeah.
because I've made like an intricate machine, but it's usually held together with duct tape. And then I get very understandable feedback that I often agree with, but my rig is not robust enough or feature rich enough to incorporate that specific thing, and I have to go in and rewire all the expressions just to do this one little thing. And that's only a reflection on me not making a rig with enough foresight. But that's always a frustrating sort of facepalm moment for
Yeah.
me.
I mean, I don't discount you at all for that because rigging is such a complex thing, a process, and it is natural to want to just keep adding more and more features. But when you're doing this for a client, when it's not just a fun little project that's like, how far can I push this? Obviously, you're going to try and do the bare minimum. With obviously with a little bit of foresight of like, well, if I need this extra range, I should go ahead and put this in. But I'm sure there are times where there's just things that come up after that you can't account for. So I totally agree and can understand that feeling. So once the client has had a first view of this in, the full piece in motion, what kind of feedback are you anticipating from them? I'm sure it's different from client to client, but are you presenting something that you are basically ready to say this could be the final? If you are good with it, we think this is good enough to be the final.
Yeah, in this specific one, it was such a big undertaking that each round of animation was kind of like a status update in this specific project. Ideally, round one of animation is, hey, we think this is ready to publish. But in this case, it was like, here is the animation, except for non-hero characters. They're not animated yet. They're still just little, paper dolls just
Yeah.
moving around on the screen. And I don't know because Kyle and Alesis were the ones interfacing with the client. I don't know how hard it was to explain that these characters that aren't moving in this R1 animation, they're actually going to move. So don't say, why are the characters not moving?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we ever really got any type of feedback like that, fortunately, because we were pretty upfront about, hey, this is the work that still needs done at this point. This is what we've accomplished. This still needs to happen. So they were at least expecting and anticipating, like, okay, maybe don't comment on the walk cycle of the characters because it's not even touched yet.
Right.
They're just kind of shuffling along.
After you've gotten, some of these status updates, like you said, taken care of, and you got to the point where, okay, the animation work is done. Here it is. What are the next steps? Because like sound design, obviously that's not going to happen until the client said, okay, yeah, we like this. So what does that kind of final part of this visual component look like?
So actually, sound design happened probably a little earlier than we normally might, for the very reason of we always feel like our sound designer is just like that beautiful cherry on top that like really rounds out the visuals, just to have a little bit of support and emphasize certain moments. It goes a really long way. So we like to incorporate him fairly early. If I'm not mistaken, he was working in at least animation R1, which was still like paper doll status, and they had he had the broad strokes, but was at least accentuating them when he could. Once we got to, as we said, it was a kind of status update progress report. It was probably like the last week before we finished early, weirdly enough, but the last week before we were about to do last looks, when me and Andrew are kind of in that, like, how much more time do we actually want to spend on this versus can we just say that we're done and be comfortable with what we're putting out there? Because we had this was one I think that we went above and beyond just because we were really jazzed about it and had a lot of passion behind it, and we had to avoid the temptation of what if we just tweak this a little bit and maybe we'd add this little extra nuance here. There was just a point where art is done and we're going to be happy if this goes out in the world. And I think we both recognized at some point pretty early in the process, like if our data corrupted and for some reason this was the version that went out into the world and that was the final delivery piece, we would be satisfied still with it. But I think we had another like 2 rounds after that we still just kept polishing and tweaking till we were a little bit more happy with it.
Yeah, I think that most of the feedback that we implemented in the later phases was internal. I think that the client was pretty happy early on in the animation rounds of revision. And yeah, animation just takes as long as you have.
Yeah. Well, that's great. That you have that ability to at least kind of think through how much more can we handle. When are we going to reach that point where we need to just say, okay, it's done. Well, this has just been great insight into the entire process of handling a client like this from a studio's perspective. And even though you're in completely different places, I love seeing that you're able to make this work. Do you think that this is something that freelancers who, like I was, are kind of just independent and searching for that one job at a time, do you think that it is a good idea to try and find others like you guys have to kind of form more of a regularity in the work environment and being able to not wear as many hats?
I mean, personally, absolutely. With this project we've been talking about specifically, it was a contact that approached me and wanted me to work on it. And I said, I don't want to do this alone. It is a really big undertaking. And even if it weren't, I love the opportunity to work with other people and divide out the parts of the process in an efficient way so that I get to hone in on the part that I'm actually good at. And it makes the work a little better when we can actually divide and conquer and have like this nice relay effect. I get to make sure that the visuals and the design is solid, and I know confidently that Andrew's going to take that and run with it and just be able to bring it up and build off of it in a way that I don't think I would have the energy to do on my own. So at all possibilities and avenues that you can, I always encourage you to work with other people, be that in a studio environment, even if you're just a solopreneur, a freelancer on your own, maybe just give it a shot. If you know a designer, if you're an animator and doing both design and animation, maybe just split yourself by finding a talented person that you can really rely on and see what it looks like when you divide and conquer.
if there's someone watching who is just a solo freelance animator and you find yourself working consistently with the same group of people, that might be an indication that there's something there. Obviously, make sure you trust them, make sure that you're comfortable dividing the labor and giving up that control, because there's a lot of trust involved when you do that. And the other big perk has been like the process notes that we had on this project, they carried over to the next project because it's the same team. And I think there is a benefit from the client side to see a unified studio face instead of, hey, I'm Andrew and this is my friend Alesis and this is my friend Kyle. We all have different email addresses, but we're the team you're working with. I think that can be a little bit more confusing.
Right.
Yeah.
That is such a great reason to do what you guys are doing. So I'd encourage anyone who's watching this that is interested, maybe this is the next step for your career as a motion designer, illustrator, whatever it is. But I just, again, want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and to all of my viewers and giving us this really in-depth look behind the scenes on how you guys handle a project as a studio. So thank you, Alesis, Kyle, and Andrew for being here and for sharing everything.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having us. It's been fun.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks again so much to the team at Yond for joining me on this interview and sharing your insights. Be sure to check out their work at yond.studio, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.